Hi, everybody. It's Wednesday. We're halfway through our second week. We're halfway done with the class, so it's moving really, really fast. Um, okay, so we're having a little chat today, and let me lay out what I'm going to talk about, and then we'll give you a little bit of an idea of what's coming down the road. So today we're going to talk about the New Deal, and we're going to talk some about the artwork that you were looking at, both the link to the Flickr show of called 1934 New Deal for Artists, and the post office murals that were contained in the Going to the source book. Now, since we've exhausted all of our Edward O'Donnell lectures, um, which you'll have to tell me whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. I thought that they were pretty useful half an hour overviews and lectures to get information from. We don't have those anymore. I don't want to give you a whole half an hour lecture the way O'Donnell does, but I do want to, since we're through that, I do want to add just a little bit of perspective towards the she readings, because the she readings give you a nice narrative sense of what happened. So you can follow sort of the course of the Great Depression and the New Deal from 1929 through the 1930s and have a pretty good sense of what the major laws were, what the politics was, who the personalities were. What O'Donnell gave you and what I will give you just a little bit of is a bit of a way to think about, well, why is this important? Why is this significant? How do we think about this particular moment as a change over time? Or how do we go from here to here? So before talking about the specific sources in the world of art, and for me to explain what I'm getting at there, let me just say a little bit about a way that you might think about the significance of the New Deal, because I do think that it is a signal transitional moment in American politics in general. But here's what's, I think, really going on. Here's why, as a student of history, you should understand what the New Deal does. The New Deal fundamentally changes the relationship between Americans and the government, particularly the federal government. There is very much, I would argue, a before and after the New Deal. And after the New Deal, the relationship between American citizens and the federal government is fundamentally different. And the basic nature of that difference is that the federal government is simply much more actively involved in the lives of ordinary Americans, to the sense where ordinary Americans I can actively feel the presence of the federal government in their lives in a way that most of them wouldn't before the New Deal. Certainly in the 19th century, you wouldn't. Here's a good example of how we might think about this. When there is a natural disaster, for instance, like the Camp Fire in California that happened recently, or the flooding in Houston, Texas that happened a couple of years ago, or when there is an economic tremor, when it looks like there might be a recession, definitely, if there is going to be something like a depression, think to the 2008 financial scandal, the financial crisis that came out of the housing market. The question in 2008 was not, nobody was asking for conservative, liberal, nobody was saying, should the federal government be involved and play a role in dealing with this? The question was, what role should the federal government play? What are the tools that the federal government should use? Before the New Deal, the question was, should the government be involved? And in fact, in the previous major depression, the one that we've already talked about from the 1890s, the federal government basically was not involved. That the answer to the question in the 1890s was no, the federal government shouldn't do too much to deal with this. And after the New Deal, the answer is not whether the government should be involved, but what it should do when it's involved. And that's a critical transformation. Let me give you just a little bit of way of thinking about what the New Deal meant to be on its own terms and a bit of the legacy of it. I'll just say 2 or 3 minutes of content here before talking about the sources. So this phrase, a New Deal, it's something you've been exposed to many times before, I'm sure. I'm sure you studied some of this in high school. And when you hear the phrase a New Deal, you probably have some sort of idea of that its policies arising from Franklin Roosevelt. I just want to take that phrase and make it explain it a little bit, because it's so familiar that I think sometimes we can overlook the significance of what it actually means. Saying a New Deal the way that Franklin Roosevelt said it, it sounds kind of folksy. It's a new deal. So I'm going to go away from the folksiness and go into professor mode and say, okay, is there a more sophisticated version of saying the New Deal? Here's what I think the New Deal really is. The New Deal is Franklin Roosevelt's proposal of what in political science terms we would call a new social contract. Okay, this notion of the social contract emerges out of political philosophy in the 18th and 19th century. And the basic idea of a social contract is that peoples and their rulers enter into a basically unstated agreement about the relationship between the two, where rulers and leaders say, I will do this for you, the people, and the people say, okay, and then we will recognize the authority and be loyal to you, our leaders. And each society, and certainly every nation, develops its own sort of social compact. Well, the social compact before the New Deal was essentially, we, the government, will leave you, the people, alone, and you, the people, can work out lives on your own terms. And this was obviously a revolutionary principle in the 18th century. It was appealing to a lot of people because that is the way that Americans in the 18th and 19th century had defined what freedom was. Freedom meant freedom from a government interfering in your life. The New Deal means a new social contract, a new relationship between citizens and the people who the citizens elect to rule them, the government. And here is how Franklin Roosevelt recalibrates that. He doesn't say, okay, social crisis, the Depression has undermined our economy. It has led to fascism and dictatorship across Europe. We are on the precipice of a total collapse. Therefore, we need to completely repudiate the old social contract based on individual liberty and limited government. He doesn't say that. He says we need to preserve individual liberty, but we can only do it by changing the terms of what American freedom means. American freedom can no longer mean only every individual is free to do what they want and the government just stays uninvolved. The key change that Roosevelt makes can be seen in the key piece of legislation for all of the New Deal. And there are lots of laws, and many of them are important, but nothing is more central than the Social Security Act of 1935. The Social Security Act, I will argue, is the key piece of legislation of the New Deal, and it's probably the most important single piece of legislation in the 20th century, for sure, maybe all of American history. In terms of an act of Congress, I'd probably go so far as to say Social Security is probably the most important legislative act of Congress ever, because it fundamentally laid the groundwork for what an American social insurance program would look like, what an American welfare state would look like. America did not have a welfare state before the Social Security Act, and every change in America's welfare state, be it Medicare, Medicaid, Obamacare, what have you, was all kind of built on the back of the Social Security Act. So we have to take the Social Security Act at the center of this new social compact that FDR is proposing. Let's consider the choice of words here. Social security. We can assume that the opposite of Social Security, let's invert this. The opposite of Social Security would be what? Something like individual anarchy, or at the most generous, individual freedom to do whatever you want to do. Well, Roosevelt wants to preserve individual freedom, but what he's saying with the Social Security Act is, if you don't have economic security, then you cannot have individual freedom. That without the government providing a measure of a social safety net, a measure of a welfare state, a measure of some sort of insurance policy, a measure of economic security, you will not have a secure society. And if you don't have a secure society, you can kiss things like individual liberty goodbye. So the basis of the New Deal is to recast the notion of American freedom that takes the old 18th, 19th century visions of individual liberty and weds it to a new 20th century understanding of the role of government in providing the economic security that is necessary to carry on those older notions of freedom. So when we hear New Deal, think new relationship between citizens and the government, new role for the government in defining what American freedom really is. Okay, so that's a bit of an interpretive thing that you can take from that. Okay, in the next 6 or 7 minutes or so, the remaining time here, let's take this big picture thinking about what the New Deal is and focus it in on the particular sources that we have for today. And we are looking today at works of art, particularly paintings. So let me kind of explain why I think this is worth doing, why I think the paintings are an interesting way to think about the 1930s and to think about the New Deal. And one way that we can get at some of the ideas that are sort of circulating in the 1930s is, I'll just share this. I pulled this off my refrigerator this morning. If you can recognize this, this is Woody Guthrie. Woody Guthrie playing his guitar, and he's got a nice little quote there. Woody Guthrie becomes famous by the end of the 1930s and the early 1940s. Later, he will write songs like This Land Is Your Land and other songs that you might know. But he moves from Oklahoma to Southern California in the 1930s because Oklahoma, West Texas, the area that he's from, is economically devastated by the Dust Bowl. And he winds up in Southern California working at a radio station. Initially, he's hired to do the sort of really cheesy, corny hillbilly humor is basically what he's hired for, to entertain a lot of the other Okies and Arkies that have relocated from the central part of the country to Southern California during the Great Depression. But in time, he starts writing and singing songs and recording songs. And if you know anything about Woody Guthrie, the type of songs that he becomes famous for will in time be known as folk music. Well, folk music as a concept, as a genre, doesn't really exist before the 1930s and 1940s. There's music that might be sung here or there, and then there's popular music, in other words, recorded music, commercial music. Well, folk music starts to become its own self-identified genre at this time. And I want to point to that because I think that that tells us that there is something interesting and new that is going on in the culture of the 1930s. And it is linked to this notion of trying to ascertain whether or not there is a unique culture that is part of the American folk, right? Folk music means music of the people, music that comes from ordinary people, that's passed along through oral channels, that's transmitted orally. And we might oppose this notion of folk music or folk culture to what we saw yesterday in the She reading, which is mass culture. What is mass culture? Mass culture is something that is produced on a massive scale. It's basically industrially produced, and it's going out to a mass, homogenous, universal audience. So that whether you're in New York or Topeka or Portland, you're seeing the same movie, you're hearing the same song, you're seeing the same advertisement. And the ultimate purpose of mass culture, being mass produced for a mass audience, is a profit at some level. You're a movie maker that wants to make money on your movie, or you're an advertiser who wants to sell a product. So because we had seen this rise of mass culture in the 1920s, it's interesting that we would see such a concern with folk culture in the 1930s. And I think the success, the emergence of someone like Woody Guthrie as a popular performer indicates that the country is really kind of searching for some sort of identity in the culture that goes beyond the mass, that's not mass produced. that's not commercially produced. They're looking for something that they think is an authentic expression of American character, of the American spirit, of American folk culture. Can you see the connection that I'm trying to make with the paintings? Woody Guthrie communicates through song. But I think if we take a look at the paintings, whether or not it's 1934 A New Deal for Art or the post office murals, one of the things that you will notice about them is their insistent emphasis on region, on place, right? There would be some paintings of rural Minnesota and other paintings of the desert Southwest and other paintings of industrial landscapes and other paintings of vital urban cities, right? Well, what does it mean to insist on regionalism in the 1930s? It means what they're trying to do is they're trying to identify who are the people and what are the places that define American folk culture. How can we find something that is authentic and American? Now, here's the second question. So why does it become important for the federal government in its work progress agencies to support artists in the search for folk culture? Ponder that for a second. Here's my suggestion. The Great Depression was a tremendous social crisis, and it was part of a global crisis that is only going to get worse and worse until the end of the 1930s when the world erupts in warfare. There were plenty of advisors and thinkers at the time who felt that capitalism was dead and worried that democracy, liberal democracy itself, might be dead. FDR wants to save liberal democracy and capitalism. Part of the way that he tries to do that are through social programs like Social Security, but he also wants to inspire the people. He wants to present a vision of American culture to the American people, essentially to say, this is who we are, this is our character, let's preserve it. We can get through this. If we pull together and we value who we are and we value where we're coming from, there is a way that we can get through this crisis that is the Depression. So keep that in mind as you look at some of the paintings that you see. Think, for instance, of all of the paintings you see that are set in an industrial landscape. Now, it may not look romantic, but during the midst of a depression where there's 25% unemployment and where in large cities there might be 50% unemployment, it would mean a lot to see a depiction, to see an ordinary person hard at work depicted as a noble, even heroic figure, right? The valorization of work itself carried a certain, if not overtly political message, kind of a covertly political message that dignity comes from work. The government is trying to stimulate the economy to generate work. Therefore, hang in there, be patriotic, be committed to your community. This is what you can aspire to, right? The same thing could be said of all of the depictions of street life, whether it's urban street life or rural street life. Also, all of the various depictions of different kinds of people, of different races, men and women, old and young, right? What I think these artists are trying to get to is a basic collective picture of this is what America looks like. This is where America comes from. So the final kind of question that you might be thinking about as you're looking at these sources is, I kind of made the case for why I think Roosevelt valued these works of art, but ask for yourself, do you think that this is a worthwhile project? Do you think it was worthwhile, necessary even, for the government to support the works of artists in painting regional paintings, in depicting people at work, in putting up murals in post offices, which are, of course, federal buildings, to present art for the masses, that represents the masses and that represents local places and local stories and stories that might have been passed down by the folk of whatever region it is that these artists are depicting? Was this a worthwhile project? Do you think that it lends support to the broader notion of this new social contract that is the New Deal? Um, do you think that it offers an interesting counterweight to the notion of mass culture that was existing in newspapers, movies, advertisements, and those types of other cultural things that Americans would have been seeing? So keep those ideas in mind as you're looking at the sources, and post in the forum and tell me what you think. Okay, looking forward to tomorrow. I will post again tomorrow at 2 o'clock, but I'm planning not posting on Friday. What I will do tomorrow is to basically combine Thursdays and Fridays topics together because both involve World War II. Tomorrow's is more specifically focused on the war itself. We're looking specifically at those key years, 1942 and 1943. And on Friday, we're looking at the immediate post-war era, going up to about 1948. But I want to put both of them together and explain both of those assignments. The only thing that's worth noting as you go into the work for tomorrow is you'll note that I did add a link on Moodle that's called Crash Course Video World War II. Some of you might be familiar with this. There's a series of educational, or actually what I would call them edutainment type videos produced by John Green that give very short, concise, often funny and entertaining overviews of historical topics. They're quite short. It's like 15 minutes. I added it there just because if you have not studied World War II before, if you don't know that much about it, or if your memory of it is very rusty, for 15 minutes, it's a decent investment of time to watch that video. I would say probably before you do the reading, just to have that story in your head as you sit down to do the reading. It can clarify things like the chronology and who people were and how they were related to each other. So it's an optional thing, but it's a 15-minute video that provides you with a lot of information if you don't have a lot of background in the history of World War II. So that's what we'll talk about tomorrow, and I'll see you then. Enjoy the rest of your Wednesday. Thanks.